Trina, thank you for joining me here today. I'm very honored to have you here. Um, I loved your book, The Women Who. I really digged it. I'm sorry, we'll edit that out. But
You don't have to edit
the
that
Women Who
out.
Dig. Um, yeah, and it was. I have to say that in my life, I have a really hectic, busy life, and I've got a whole stack of books on my bookshelf. Some of them I started and put down, probably about four or five of them. And your book, it just sucked me in. It really engaged me right away. It was probably one of the most intense books I have read. I'll just end the sentence.
Yes.
It was, your writing. I mean, the word that comes to mind in your scriptedness is very, very visceral, and the stories of the women that you follow, these farmers all over the world, they're very hopeful, but very real, and it was the reality that you were describing that was sometimes hard to get through, and I actually, I teared up a couple times
Wow.
through the book, and I think that comes with the territory of being a new father. It's like, I got a 4 and a 2. I got a little 2-year-old daughter and a
Yeah.
4-year-old, and there is a clear like change in you, or I would assume for most dads, from pre kids and post kids. You become far more emotional afterwards. You're more worried about what's going on in the world in general. And no, it was just a great book. It was,
Thank
front
you.
to back, and so 3 years, 8 countries. And how long did it take you to write it after that?
It took probably the whole process. I was actually writing as I was doing the researching too, because I was often looking for funding to get to the next place, to get to the next country. So all in all, it took about 4 years from the very first interview to the very last round of edits with the publisher. So, and I'm glad you bring up the intensity because it was
Mm-hmm.
a very intense project to work on. I was very naive when I started this process, as I think most writers are when they set out on a journey to write a book, especially the kind of book that takes you across so many countries into different communities and cultures. And so I didn't know what an intense journey or an intense process this would be, but I'm glad to hear that feedback, because that is exactly the message that I wanted to convey through the stories, and how I was moved so emotionally as a writer and a storyteller to come face to face with women, often in their gardens or in their homes, and hear about the struggles that they're facing as food producers, and then also the amazing ways that they're innovating on the land to feed their families and support their communities.
Yeah, it says in the back here. Oh, this is Marcello.
Marcello
This is
DeCintio.
one of your mentors.
He
We'll get
is,
into him
yeah,
in a minute,
sure.
but he says, every page of this book glows with Moyles' affection for the women she travels the world to meet, an elegantly written tribute to those who coax food from the soil. I really like and
Yeah,
that really does feel like what a lot of these women are doing in
yeah,
your interviews. They're especially in some of the more extreme cases where the soil is barely alive. They're coaxing
exactly.
it out. Um, and he says your affection for these women, and I also would add to that I felt some of your frustration coming through in a lot of the stories as well, and uh, because in the first chapter, and we'll talk about Uganda. So I read the Uganda chapter, and it brought me in very quickly into these women's lives, and when I when I closed the chapter, I closed the book. I read the first chapter, I closed the book, and my blood pressure was up. I felt it, and I
Yeah.
found myself, and I was in your shoes, um, and you're a crucial part of the book. You're we follow your journey. We get put in your in your perspective. And but at the same time as I was reading this book, reading your perspective, sorry, in chapter 1, I felt stressed out for you. Being in the situation, and I found that a lot through the book. And imagining what it was like for you to take all this in, and how emotional it would have been. Maybe take me through a little bit of that. And your first 2 chapters are Uganda and Guatemala, and those are both very intense stories.
Yeah, Uganda was the place where the book was born, truly. My book does begin with telling my own story about my great-grandmother's connection to farming during World War II. And she was a homesteader just on a homestead plot just outside of Regina, Saskatchewan. But the book truly began in Uganda, and that's where I was living and working with a rural healthcare organization in 2013. I'm certainly not an agricultural expert. I'm not a farmer. My parents weren't farmers. My grandparents weren't farmers. My great-grandmother's connection to farming is the closest thing I have to my agricultural roots. And so here I was working in a role as a communications sort of specialist and support for this rural healthcare organization in southern Uganda in a town called Kabale with the Chigezi Healthcare Foundation. And my work brought me face to face with women farmers almost on a daily basis. I learned very quickly that women are the backbone of food security in Uganda and arguably in the world, certainly in East Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. I believe the percentage is like over 60% of women in Uganda are small-scale or subsistence farmers, and they're typically farming like 1 to 2 acres, and their plots are usually scattered in different places. So you're growing maybe sorghum here and sweet potatoes there. And they called them, in the local dialect, they called them the Abahinji Mukazi, which is a Ruchiga word that translates literally into English as the women who dig.
Yeah.
And what struck me as so interesting is they had a different word for farmer. And that wasn't it. They didn't see women as farmers. The people they saw as farmers typically had large plots of land, access to modern agriculture, what we call modern agriculture, the use of tractors and lots of technology, modern seeds, access to markets, and typically growing cash crops. In Uganda, the biggest cash crops tend to be non-food crops like coffee, tea. Of course, coffee and tea are foods, but of course you can't live off of those crops.
Well, I would argue, maybe you could. I live off coffee.
Yeah,
that's debatable.
That is true.
We'll
That's mostly what I had for breakfast this morning. So, touche. But in Uganda, certainly you can't feed those crops to your children, right? And so women were the ones feeding children, providing the bread basket for the region. Yet they weren't given the distinction as farmers. And also those farmers growing cash crops tended to be largely male. I noticed that. And I thought, that's such a we got to change the narrative. This is the wrong way to look at who's truly producing food in our world. I think we often tend to look at large-scale agriculture as the answer to food security. And what people don't often realize is it's not necessarily the food crops being grown large-scale that are truly feeding people. It's this collective network of small-scale farmers around the world, particularly in the global south in places like Uganda and India, where small-scale farmers are actually doing the work and getting food onto the dinner table every night. And the farmers that I met in southwestern Uganda were certainly what we would consider to be economically poor, but they were still very much tied to their traditional food economy, which was directly, you go to the garden in the morning, you dig, you sow, you weed, you tend to the pests, you tend to your children in the garden, and then you harvest sweet potatoes, for example, and you bring them home, and that's what your children eat at the end of the day. So my book began truly in Uganda, wanting to change the narrative around who's truly growing food and who's supporting community and well-being. And I was so inspired by those women that I met. And yet another thing I realized when I began setting out on a boda boda, which is a motorcycle taxi in Uganda, sandwiched between usually the driver and my translator, Lillian, who helped translate the language and also a lot of the cultural context and was just so helpful throughout this process. And as we traveled up and down the hills in this particular area, which they call the Switzerland of Africa, so it was certainly not that flat, hot, dusty stereotype that people sometimes tend to think of.
Very lush,
it was
and
very
green
lush, and the joke was you can drop anything into the soil there and it will grow. Yeah, they only had a dry season of about 2 months, so it was an excellent place to grow food, and it's certainly considered like a breadbasket region of Uganda and also East Africa, because a lot of the food grown there would be feeding other countries around Uganda, grown by women, of course.
Okay.
And one of the first places I went for research in Uganda was this community called Marindi, and it started, my first interview was with a group of women who were working together and pooling their labor and their resources and their ideas and their support to help one another be more productive on the land. So whereas many of their husbands would seek like day labor elsewhere, so either going into town,
hanging out at the bars.
Exactly. Sadly, the issue of alcoholism was really huge in Uganda, and a barrier to food productivity, of course, because you have fewer people working on the land together, and yet so women were doing most of the work, and yet men also held most of the decision-making power. And then key to the story that I told in my book, men also held the key to land ownership. So women can legally own land in Uganda, but very few do, because culturally speaking, it's still very taboo. Like that women's group that I interviewed, I remember them laughing when I brought up the question, like, wouldn't you want to own your own land? And they're like, our husbands would think that we've bewitched them, Like, women just do not own land. Women need land to be considered women, working the land, but they don't necessarily have security over the land.
If they're not working their husband's land, their status as a valuable woman in society isn't there.
Exactly.
Right?
And that came out very strong with the older women that I interviewed in these farming groups. And so after that first group interview, I started to notice this dynamic where you see an older generation, certainly more outspoken than the women in these group contexts. So they'd be very against the idea of women owning land or of marital property rights, which was being a huge thing that was being discussed at the time in 2013. There was this bill they called the Marriage and Divorce Bill, and it was being debated at the parliamentary level for the 4th time in history. And one of the things in it was, if a woman decides to leave her husband or divorce or separate, does she have access to her husband's assets? And because men, the land is mostly patrilineal in Uganda, so men typically, sons inherit land from boys, which isn't so different from how it used to be in Canada as well, or is still today in some respects, although that's changing. So this was being debated, and there was certainly no engagement at the rural level, at least in southwestern Uganda where I did my research. Women were not consulted about this. When I asked them about it, yes, the older women kind of laughed and said, like, no, we have bigger issues to focus on than owning land.
We're trying to feed our children
exactly
and survive
today. Yeah, they have bigger issues, and there is such a risk of domestic violence and really strong patriarchy in parts of rural Uganda and urban Uganda, as is elsewhere around the world, that I think women felt afraid to bring that issue into their homes and into their communities. But what we found was when we went back to the community the next day, actually, and interviewed women one-on-one, the younger women told me, yes, we would want land. Yeah. Yes, that I remember this one woman told me, it's no different than my kitenge. And kitenge is a Ugandan dress that women wear. It's this usually these beautifully colored fabrics that women wrap around their waists, and it's the same fabric they'll use to tie their babies on their backs and go into the fields to dig. And she placed her hands on her lap and she said, it's just like this kitenge, I own this kitenge. No one can take this kitenge away from me. If this kitenge was borrowed, maybe I would have to give this kitenge back, she'd be stripped. Yeah. She'd be stripped of her clothing. And so she was equating that to land. She didn't want to be stripped from her land if something happened with her husband, if her husband died, or if, her husband took on another wife, because polygamy is practiced there. So the younger women, I think, really saw the value in land ownership.
And what I took from it, so this is one of the very first I made notes through preface, preface,
Yeah. Preface.
or preface. I don't know.
Potato.
I'm from New Brunswick, so
Yeah.
tomato. But in chapter 1, I said, it felt like a fictional tale from a dystopian future
Yeah.
or the horrible past. But it's the present.
It's the present.
It's the present. It's happening right now, and the plot of land for these women, just to touch on again on the significance of it, it's not a matter of owning something, like the dress is a good example, and just giving you a little bit of self-worth. It's, if I don't own the land, I will starve. My family will starve. I won't be able, or I may have to go into some horrendous other form of work, or I won't have value. It's literally, and however big that plot of land is, and you can correct me, but I believe some of them are, quarter acre, maybe not even, just this tiny plot of land. And if you don't have that to farm as a woman, but your husband owns it, you might not be able to feed your children.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. It's a really like a life or death situation for a lot of these female farmers. And I mean, around the world, like statistically speaking, women own less than 20% of the arable farmland. And I'm sure in Uganda, in a place like Uganda, that number would be below 5%. In Canada, it's around 28%, which is still low. So yes, a history of patriarchy and patrilineal land succession really has placed farmland and resources in the hands of male farmers. And certainly there's co-ownership, situations as well too. But it's my belief, I mean, from talking, especially with the younger women that I met in Uganda, that yes, land ownership is a huge thing, and it increases their ability to produce food without having to worry. If my husband divorces me tomorrow or takes on another wife, what am I going to do? And where is she going to go? A lot of these women, yes, had some access to education, maybe primary, maybe a few grades at a high school level. But quite likely, especially in rural Uganda, most women are not going to post-secondary level. So what other skills do they have? Do they have to move to a city to be productive, to find jobs? I really saw that. It's not only just an economic thing, but I think women's sense of well-being, especially if you're born into a rural context, your sense of well-being is on the land. That's what you know. That's where your spirituality resides. That's where your community resides. And for women, that's how you do your job. That's how you feed your community and the world. So,
yeah, it really felt like, and this was an ongoing theme throughout the book, especially in the lesser developed countries, Nicaragua and India. It felt like the women glued everything together and held the family unit together, the sustenance of everything. And it's like the mortar of everything, but they didn't have any freedom at all, and it was just every day they would get out of bed to continue to be that glue, while their husbands, and in Uganda especially, and in Guatemala, they had the freedom to do whatever they'd like. And how do you address, like, were there men that you ran into in these countries that seem to be changing their perspective, or were they all hard-lined? I mean, when you talk about even the older generation of women didn't want to have anything to do with this revolution of women owning land, and I think that's consistent societal worldwide. The older you get, the more acceptant a lot of humans are of the way things are, and they get comfortable, whether or not they've got freedom or whatever the case is, or maybe they're they and then they can be more afraid of change, and the younger you are, the more fearless you are. So but were there men in these communities that wanted to see that change as well, or?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And that's a great question. And some people have asked me, like, why didn't you include more perspectives of men in the book? And maybe I should have, you know.
Yeah.
That's just not the way I chose to write it at the time. But I
Yeah.
did see examples of women who certainly seemed more empowered on the land because they had the buy-in from their husband, because they had the support of their husband. So I write about Diana in the Uganda chapter, and it was really interesting because she was actually she was working as a farmer to not only feed her family, but also raise the tuition money for her husband to go to agricultural school at a post-secondary level, which I found very interesting. And I didn't include it in the book, but I asked her about that afterwards. And
you mentioned it in the book.
I mentioned it.
You said that in the book. Yeah.
And a larger part of that conversation was saying, like, well, don't you think that you deserve to also go to school? And she said, well, this is just the way it is given our situation for, you know, they don't have access to childcare.
Yeah.
Who's going to stay home and take care of the children and then also do the actual growing and bring money into the home? So her husband was sharing knowledge with her when he gets home from school or what. So that was interesting to see a husband-wife dynamic in Uganda, where you can see they're younger.
Yeah.
They've probably had more access to formal education than the older generation. These ideas of, I wouldn't say feminism, but because they didn't like that word feminism.
Yeah.
But ideas of gender equality are more accepted, and people can see the value in them, not just culturally, but also economically too. So that was one example. And certainly in other countries, I did see examples where men, of course, were supporting women in agriculture. Like that happens. I hope I don't paint this picture in my book that that's not happening.
No. There was. I mean, that wasn't the focus of your book. It's not called People Who Dig.
Yeah.
It's called Women Who Dig. So what was there a specific? You're a journalist in general, right? That's what you've done for a profession. You're a writer. And this is your first book?
It is,
This is your very first, your first book. So was there a specific moment in Uganda? So you say that's when the book was born. Was it when you heard the term Women Who Dig and you're like, that's a great title? Or was there, because it is a great title, but was there like a pinnacle moment that you can identify, or did it all just kind of come clear throughout your experience there?
I wouldn't have known it at the time, but I can trace it back now. And yes, there was a moment where I think this book truly was born on paper as a story. And I write about it in the Uganda chapter. And it ties into this issue of land that was happening very hotly and very controversial in Uganda at the time that I was there. And I was finishing up my shift at the organization in town, about to leave the office, and I ran into a colleague of mine who's a midwife. Everybody called her Sister Clara. And I loved talking with her because she was born in those hills and she had delivered, hundreds of babies. She knew those women's stories better than anyone. And of course, because those women's stories, in a way, were also her story. Yeah. And we were talking, and she was telling me this terrible thing that had happened. She told me this story about this woman who, just outside of Kabale in a rural community, who had walked down to the chairman's office in her community. And the chairman is sort of the head of the municipality in these small communities. And she attempted to sign her name into her husband's land title. And word got out in the community very quickly. And when she got home, her husband killed her. And this story did not make it into the local media, not the national media. No one knew about the story other than people in that community. And I think, unfortunately, because violence against women is such a common thing in some of these countries, that people just sort of accepted it. There seemed to be very little justice happening on this woman's behalf. And that triggered me. I mean, and Sister Clara too, like she just shook her head and she looked so sad, and she said, I just don't know what's happening here, and I don't know what's going to happen in the future.
So that happened while you were there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was an act. Well, yeah.
And I went back to the place where I was living that night, and I sat down at my computer and I typed out this furious essay. And sometimes, you get writer's block, and sometimes the words just come so naturally. And this essay just happened, and I called it "My Daughter Wants to Be a Farmer." And it was a look at, and I mean, because I was working in international development at the time, I wanted to challenge the idea of development and aid, and like, we have to shift this narrative from strictly looking at what's the best seeds to use, what's the best technology, what's the best method of growing food to feed communities. And I was arguing women are feeding these communities. And so we need to look at how do we protect women's bodies on the land?
Yeah.
How do we address things like domestic violence? How do we bring these social factors into a conversation on food sustainability and food security? That essay happened so naturally. And I think it was the first, 1,200 words that I wrote on the subject. And after that, I wanted to collect more stories from women. And I think the project just sort of grew from there. And so I wouldn't have known it at the time, but I think that's where this book was born.
That was the moment, that essay.
That was the trigger.
Did that essay make it in here, or parts of it? Or it's
parts of it
separate?
did.
Okay,
yeah, parts of it definitely did.
I'll have to go read the essay now.
Yeah. And who knows?
If you published it.
Yeah, who knows where the essay even lives now? I mean, it was one of the first things I published. So, yeah.
So your journey was... Yeah, Uganda, Guatemala, Nicaragua, United States, and Canada, which I when I initially flipped through the book, I saw, I was seeing what countries you went to. I was happy that they were in there. India, the New Congo, and Cuba. So that's the order that your chapters go. Is that the order that you went to these countries in, or did you reorder them afterwards?
I did reorder them a little bit. Yeah, and I'm trying to think if there was really a rhyme to or reason to that. I mean, I was trying to balance the content because some of the stories are very, like you said, they're very intense.
Yeah.
So of course, when you're thinking of a narrative, you want to find a way to redeem the reader, for the reader to find some redemption in the stories. And so ending on Cuba was a very strategic thing because the interviews I did there were so positive.
Yeah.
The last group meeting I did with men and women brought me to tears, and I thought, this is how I have to close this story. So it isn't quite
you found that ending.
Yeah, I found that ending. So it's not quite the trajectory that my actual travels took me on, but it's fairly close. Yeah.
And Cuba, ended up. The United States and Canada are obviously two of the better, where women are in better circumstances, and it's gaining traction, right, in an ongoing basis, and that was. After Uganda, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and they're right in the middle of the book. It was kind of that. It was those more relieving 2 chapters that you read, and then in Cuba, but Cuba shone through as the kind of most hopeful. It was a great way to end the book. It seemed where women were valued the most as the integral part of what got Cuba out of their food crisis that started in 1959, I think it was, with the Soviet Union's ended
in 1989.
Oh, 89.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
89. Yeah. Okay, and they ended their they just pulled out of Cuba, and they weren't doing industrial agriculture anymore. And walk me through Cuba. And there is a gentleman, there is a man that is highly featured in that chapter as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Cuba actually was the very last place I went to do the research too, and so that was a nice way for me to bring my journey full circle and talking to women who really radiated empowerment and hope and a feeling of being valued and dignity on the land. And I had previous experiences had brought me to Cuba originally. And actually this is to back way up. I had no interest in agriculture, and I think it was probably 2010. I was working in international development.
Yeah.
And I got asked to be an assistant translator because I speak Spanish, or at least my Spanish is passable. So I was asked to come along and help translate on this organic farm tour, and it was run by Ron Barazan, who has the Urban Farmer. He used to be from Edmonton, but he's based out of Powell River, BC now.
Okay.
And over the last 10 years, he's been organizing these really dynamic cross-cultural tours with Canadians, people from the UK, the US, traveling to Cuba to learn about their organic and sustainable agriculture revolution that happened after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. So the first time I went there, I was just blown away by the small scale, low resource examples that Cuba has on a really kind of institutional level, actually, in cities and then also in rural parts where they were forced to go back to farming in a more traditional way. So
explain what happened there.
Yeah, so after the Soviet Union collapsed in '89, of course, all of the imports that were coming into Cuba, fossil fuels, synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, cattle feed, all of these things, these huge inputs that are required to make modern or conventional agriculture work, to to keep the tractors fueled in the fields, so to speak. That shut down overnight, essentially. Within 1 year, I think on average, Cubans lost like 30 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah, the average Cuban, lost
so
30 pounds.
Their food system was shut down overnight.
Yeah, it was a collapse, essentially. So people were forced to make different decisions on the land, and that happened at an institutional level, including things like transforming idle land in cities to grow vegetables on a large scale, and to ensure that every neighborhood had one of these city-urban farms to feed people, and that food was subsidized to make it affordable for everybody in the neighborhood and the community. And you also found that, like the women I interviewed, for example, some of them were like biology high school teachers. They too were disconnected from farming. They didn't come from farming backgrounds. They had grown up in cities, and suddenly had the opportunity to, in a sense, go back to school. It wasn't really school, but the government made it very accessible for people to turn to, like if you're struggling in your current job, like maybe try farming. And of course, people just did that on a household level too. So people growing food on their balconies in their backyards, basically just trying to turn every inch of space in Cuba into a productive food system. And
that was a drastic shift from a lot of the chapters most of those women, one was a PhD mathematician, I believe, and the other one was a biologist, and and an artist. I got really, they were the Cuban chapter. They're all very colorful women, and literally, you actually described the color of their clothes.
Yeah.
So they're dressed colorfully as well. But I really like this line. And this is from Odalis? Is that how you say your name? Odalis?
That's right.
Okay, first shot. Agriculture is also a form of artistic expression, insisted Odalis. They call it agriculture because it makes us human. We are not practicing agriculture only for commercial purposes. We plant to feel happiness and to feel joy for what's growing on our land. Growing food is a form of art. It's the supreme art. Nature paints what no painter can achieve.
Yeah.
I just love that. And I honestly, I have never put. It's not that I didn't notice the word culture is in agriculture, but to hear it described like that in that cultural premise by an artist, really hit me. It really drags out that meaning behind farming. And in her case, she wasn't able to practice her art in the city, so she created this living art garden, essentially.
It was amazing. I mean, she was originally from a city, and she had no intention of ever farming. Fell in love with an agronomist and a man who wanted to start his own sustainable farm outside of the city, and she was compelled to go to the farm. And so I asked her, I said, Odalis, like, what do you love more? Because she was a potter. She did beautiful ceramics, these lovely sculptures that are sort of integrated into their farm. And I said, Odalis, like, what do you love more? Do you love farming or do you love making art? And she corrected me, and that's when she said, no, farming. And nature is the supreme art. So those things go hand in hand, and were so important to her identity, I think, as a woman and a farmer, an artist and a mother. So inspired by that. You talk to people in Cuba, and in some ways, I think because art is so present in their culture, everybody's a poet, everybody's a musician. Though every interview I did in Cuba nearly brought me to tears, if not brought me to tears, because women were so passionate about what they did. And it transcended, it was much more than just a job. It was, they're calling it the supreme art, that sits with their identity. And just the passion was so alive in those women, the empowerment. And I think that's important. I think it's a good place to mention that it's because women have had such access to healthcare, access to education in Cuba, essentially for decades now, access to a minimum nutrient intake, right? Like, because they've got a national milk feeding program. There's some foods that are provided to families in like these monthly rations. So, if you're someone who's been in, say, like Latin America or Central America, it's not hard to see visible poverty, especially in cities. It's everywhere. Yeah. Go to Cuba. I mean, of course, poverty exists in Cuba as well. But to me, my eyes were just open the first time I went to Cuba. Like, wow, they've done something different here. And I don't want to romanticize Cuba to the point of saying that there aren't issues or there aren't human rights issues there as well, or, limitations of freedom of expression. Certainly Cuba, has struggled as well. But just on the basis of access to education, access to healthcare, I would say that is a big reason that women feel so empowered on the land is they're able to identify the resources in their communities, defend what they want to do on their land, or petition for support what they want to do on their land. Like, they know how to work the system because they're educated.
And that's
they're healthy. They're relatively healthy.
And that really seems to be the obvious equalizer for women in any society and it's just those basic fundamental life requirements, healthcare, education, and a roof over their head and accessibility. Because in any society, I mean, even in Canada, I have 2 children now. I didn't personally birth them. My wife had to take care of that part of it. And, when you talk about Canada, I mean, just right there. I mean, no matter what, by default, there's these automatic things in life that are already adding these additional burdens to women that that men don't have. So it's not that, it depends on your social circumstance. It's not that the men are free from looking after their children, but there is just a more significant intensity around a woman in any culture to bear the burden of raising children initially in those first few years. My daughter's 2 years old and she's just finally coming around to dad right now. Before that, she's been glued to mom, pretty significantly. But when you look at the Uganda and Cuba, it's just black and white. They have none of that in Uganda. And they have all of that in Cuba. They've got their basic fundamental needs met on a daily basis, and then they're able to, advance and go beyond that, because that at least gives them that foundation, right?
And I think it's interesting too, because like, especially those 2 different contexts, like in Uganda, farming wasn't necessarily a choice. Women didn't necessarily want to become farmers. It just that was the job available to them. That was the knowledge set available to them. That's what had been passed. That's what they knew how to do, and they didn't necessarily have the education or the resources to to break into any other sort of sector. Whereas in Cuba, many of those women weren't farmers, and so it was a choice. They had education. Yes, Nilda has her she's working on her PhD. Edith was a high school biology teacher. Odales studied fine arts and history, and these women chose farming as a livelihood. Yeah. And I think that we can make a comparison with what's happening in Canada right now too, because it's so interesting that a lot of the women that I interviewed around the age of 35 would be like the average age of women that I interviewed in Canada. And a lot of these women were generations disconnected from farming and agriculture. They'd gone to university maybe and taken a class in political science or like global food politics. Yeah. Or maybe they've listened to a speaker who's talking about, the link between like environmental sustainability, stewardship of soil or hydroponics, growing food in different ways. And so a lot of these very educated women disconnected from farming in Canada are breaking into the field right now. And they all tell me like, farming was not on my radar. It was never something that I saw myself doing, but it's a choice that they're doing it today.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's driving this new sort of niche of food production is they're just blindly passionate, like, well, I don't even think they're blind, but like the joke is like, a lot of the women are like, well, I wanted to trade in the 9-to-5 lifestyle. And then I realized that farming was like a 6-to-6 lifestyle, right?
I like that line. Yeah, that's really good. It's like, so true. It's because you're becoming an entrepreneur.
Yes.
Instantly.
Yes.
Instantly. So it's so much more than, gardening or farming, just planting things. It's a double whammy. You're going out now to produce food, and you instantly have to become an entrepreneur because if your goal is to sustain your household off of those products.
Yeah.
So
one of the gals I interviewed for this book, I didn't include her story in the book because there were so many stories.
Yeah.
But it's been amazing to watch her grow over the last 4 years. Her name is Vanessa Hanul, and she runs Micro YYC in Calgary. And 4 years ago, she set out growing microgreens in her basement under, just a simple set of grow lights. And she sold her first crop at, like the Calgary Farmers Market. And today she's operating in a 1,500 square foot warehouse in Calgary. Wow. And she's supplying over 12 locations. I was there just last week and was totally blown away by how far she's come. But her background is certainly not agriculture, it's business and marketing. Yeah. She did a master's in marketing, and that has aided her tremendously in getting her story out there. And it's the story that people are interested in. It's not necessarily even her product, though her product is delicious and beautiful, these gorgeous microgreens that, both families are consuming, and then like top chefs in Calgary are integrating into their meals. So, I mean, she's catering to like all spectrums of people in Calgary. It's her background in marketing, I think, that is really, and her story that is really appealing to people. This young woman, breaking the glass ceiling, not just in the world of business, but also in terms of agriculture and food security. And I've been completely blown away by these women. But it is important to point out that it's a choice, that some women have the choice to be farmers, and many, if not the majority of women, do not have the choice. And sadly, a lot of the women, and I didn't want to shy away from telling these stories,
No.
We often want these like glossy, heroic triumph stories, which certainly are, I think there are a few in the book, but most of them are just these humble efforts of women busting their asses to grow food and challenge the systems in their communities in their own unique ways, in tiny, humble ways. But many of the women told me they don't want their daughters to become farmers because it's too much of a burden under the current system.
In the lesser developed situations in the less developed countries.
Although, I think in Canada too, we do. I mean, small scale farmers it's hard to make it. I think we should be cautious not to oversell this idea that this sustainable food system that's breaking in and challenging conventional agriculture is like, is it always financially viable? I think for some farmers, yes, but it's a hard game. Like, and so I think that's another story we need to focus on is like, what policies need to change around, food access and food processing, and all of those things, like Vanessa, for example, who's selling her greens in Calgary. She says, I'd love to get my product into the bigger grocery stores, but there are all of these different, stipulations that prevent me from doing so because I'm such a bit player. So there's still a lot of work, I think, that needs to happen in Canada too to make small scale farming more viable.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no, there's an adage, and obviously I'm in the farming industry, but I'll say this facetiously, but how do you make a small fortune in farming? Well, you start with a large one, and and that is unfortunately, that can be the case in a lot of situations, and it is nice to see. I don't think there's much of an illusion when people go into it in Canada. It's these same women you're talking about here, and Vanessa, but there's a willingness to take it on and figure it out, right? We're going to get in here, let's find our niche, I'll see how I can survive at this scale, and that's the big question mark. What I've found is you can be your safest spots to be in the farming industry today is really small or really big. And it's this
disappearing middle.
It's the disappearing middle. And You know, Vanessa might be able to expand up to 3 or 9,000 square feet. Maybe that'll until, but the moment that you start knocking on the grocery store's doors, which we do in our business too sometimes, then it's just this drastic drop and of margin, because you are competing with, in a lot of situations, these massively subsidized large scale farms all over the world.
Yeah.
And one of the most impactful, that actually reminds me of your Indian chapter, or India chapter, where they're ending up buying their lentils, and I know Canada is one of the largest lentil, if not, I think it's the largest lentil exporter. I'd have to double check this fact to India, other than what's produced in India. But these farmers are buying U.S. and Canadian grains and lentils cheaper than they're producing it. They're able to produce it for, or buy their own products.
Right. Yeah.
And that is just an ongoing theme around the world.
It is. It doesn't matter on the staple crop. Is it quinoa in Peru? Is it maize or corn in Guatemala or Mexico? Like these indigenous varieties of seeds and grain crops are really under threat because people can't afford to grow them. It makes more sense actually just to buy the cheaper, or it makes no sense for these indigenous or local farmers to sell their own product in the market because no one's going to buy it. A lot of this comes down to like political and economic agreements that we have, whether it's free, like there's no such thing as free trade. None of it is free, especially for poor, marginalized rural communities, especially for rural, often lower income farmers and small scale subsistence farmers in places like India and Uganda and Mexico. Part of the reason that there's so many migrant farm workers in the United States is the fact that they've been pushed off their land. They're no longer economically viable because of agreements like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which make it, because of the imported subsidized grains that are coming in from the US, make it impossible for them to compete with those prices in the market and have pushed them off their land, economically speaking. So I struggle with the idea of free trade because it doesn't often work in the benefit of rural, poor farmers.
It's always at the expense
and women.
of somebody.
It's always at the expense of someone, yeah. And I also struggle with this idea too of like, well, large scale agriculture is feeding the world. Is it really? Is it really? Like, or is the cost of that worth it? Because if we're growing lentils in Canada to feed or hypothetically feed farmers or urban populations elsewhere and pushing local food producers off their land when we know the system is based on finite resources, has a huge, greenhouse gas impact, is contributing towards climate change, which ironically is making it harder to grow food, especially in places like the global south. Like the whole system is so out of whack.
And it's a global issue.
It's a global issue.
It's not one. What I'm hearing here is all of us farmers in all countries around the world are suffering from similar circumstances because of this massive beast, this logistical food distribution infrastructure that we've put together, and we can't afford to buy our own food from ourselves. And when you say, just to put my comment on, is industrial agriculture feeding the world? You probably know these stats of most of us in the agriculture circles do. The misnomer is, I believe the first question needs to be, well, are we producing enough food to feed every human in the world? And the answer is, well, actually, yes, we are. And we're actually, in addition to that, producing enough food to sustain 70 billion farm animals every year. Yeah. So we're actually producing enough food, in theory, to sustain 77 billion living things. So you can't look at that fact and then point back to industrial agriculture and say well, we need industrial agriculture to feed the world when we're already producing 35 times more food, or whatever the multiplier would be, that would actually feed every single human on earth already, right? So I mean, it's very obvious we have a policy, infrastructure, distribution issue that is just this massive pressure on Canadian farmers, Ugandan farmers, Indian farmers.
Yeah, and in the world of like international development, this is another thing that I hope my book is just this one tiny voice contributing towards changing the narrative. But there's this idea of underproductivity, especially with people, small scale and subsistence farmers in the global south, in places like India and Uganda and Central America. And it's because we're measuring the economic output of these farmers. We call that, okay, because they're making less money on their land, they therefore are underdeveloped, that's not productive, that's pastoral agriculture. We need to introduce new seeds, new farming methods. Small-scale farmers should, ideally it makes more sense for them to go work as labor on larger plantations. And it's just not true, but it's because we're only measuring one output, and that tends to be in an economic kind of lens, right?
Yeah.
Money, profit.
Yeah.
But if we're measuring other values, like the well-being of community, the well-being of soil, of productivity, of diversity on a single plot of land. Maybe a woman is growing fruit trees. Maybe she's got chickens and pigs. She's got a mixed system. She's also stewarding the land and the environment at the same time as growing food. If we included all of those different factors into the idea of productivity, I think we would find that women, these small-scale farmers, are way more productive than a large-scale operation that's putting out one grain and at the same time it has these huge inputs and is having a really negative impact on our environment. There's no denying. I mean, spraying, thousands of acres of fields in Canada. And like you said, I mean, the farms are only getting bigger in Canada and practicing that model of agriculture. It's contaminating our waterways. It's contaminating groundwater. And it's having a huge, it's a huge footprint in terms of our emissions and not helping. It's not in our favor of really mitigating the issue of climate change. So who is more productive?
well, I mean, what I'm hearing when you talk about, the polyculture of multiple crops, if we scored it by calories, density, right? Nutrient dense, how many pounds of production and total caloric intake, is coming out of a piece of land, and how, and it all comes down to inputs. What's everybody's, we have this term called net zero, right? That everybody's obsessed with, or closed loop, right? Closed loop systems. Now, we like to say that, aquaponics is a closed loop system. Well, it is partially closed loop. That's true, but there's a little misnomer there. There's still always an input. There still always needs to be an input. And really all we can do is do our best to try to get it to that net zero, but how are you scoring it? I mean, that continually comes back to that question, like you said, how are you measuring it, right? Well, if you're measuring it by, how healthy the soil is maintained and the ongoing nutrient density of that land, and also the CO2 being captured, well, then actually we might be, if you're measuring the right things, we could surpass the net zero, and now we're putting back. Exactly. It might not be the same thing that you're inputting, right? So for us, it's fish feed. That's our one of our main inputs. Well, our fish feed comes from somewhere, so it's not a true close. We're not producing the but people are, I think that's one of the issues as well, is we take these definitions or these terms, we use it as a marketing tool, we label it onto something, we call it sustainable, and there's no silver bullet, right? One of the questions that I like to ask is, well, what are we sustaining? Right? What are the things where you're trying to sustain in this certain system, and no one form of farming. That's why it's a combination of, I believe, right? It's not, there's no one magic maneuver that we're going to make as a society. Certain things are more sustainable with water. Certain things are more less CO2 intensive, and it's about finding that balance, I think. But.
I think so. Yeah, it's interesting because I was CBC put out an article recently that was looking at women farmers in Canada and some of the success stories, and then also some of the barriers that persist. And I was lucky enough to be interviewed for that, and he just included a small quote from me. But after I read the article, and it was a fantastic article, and I scrolled through the comments, which people say like, oh, you should never read the comments on stories. But I was like, I'm just so curious because there was over 100 comments. So I was like, what are people saying about this, And this one that really, I was like, oh, thank you. I'm so glad this person, whoever it was, put this comment, because I'm going to talk about it because it's an attitude that still exists in not just the farming community, but in Canada in general. And this person was a large-scale farmer, and in fact said in his comment, like, one of the biggest in Canada, something he obviously felt very proud about. And yes, like, that's, I'm sure, an amazing feat, and it's important work that he's doing, of course. But he said, hobby farming is not farming. And I'm like, see, that's the attitude that, like, I think we need to address that attitude.
Yeah.
And I think we are. I mean, I think the sustainable food community is certainly challenging that attitude, that small-scale agriculture is not just the dust on the boot of large-scale farmers. Yeah. It has a role to play in the future of farming in Canada, and the future, and it's the now of farming in Canada. But I think the question is how can we make, what policies need to change to make small-scale agriculture more viable? Not only how to just support women into farming, but I mean, I think all people should be farming. When people ask me what's the future of farming in Canada, I think we need a diverse system. Yeah. We need large scale. We need people like that fellow who posted the comment. We need large scale. My book is certainly not asserting that we don't, because there's a role for that type of agriculture in the world, in Canada, in our systems. But we also need the hobby farmer, who has a hugely important role. We need a diverse system because with the issue of climate change, all farmers, no matter the scale, are going to be impacted by those factors that are really out of our control right now. Yeah. And Cuba's a classic example of what happens when one scale of agriculture collapses. Well, another scale rises. But maybe we can avoid having a collapse if we have a truly more diverse, strong system.
Yeah, I mean, to say that large-scale farmers, like that gentleman, cannot be sustainable, I think that would be the wrong attitude, too.
I agree.
It's a, these existing behemoths, I mean, policies or support needs to be put in place so that they can be supported, because those farmers, they are crucial, and and they're employing people. They're not getting into bed in the morning saying, "Ha ha ha, time to kill some soil, babe." No. Like they're good people,
of
right?
Course.
They're good people running good businesses, and they have come into a system, and that says to compete in this system, this is how you must farm. And unfortunately, it probably could be done better, and I think it's about opening that,
it's about integration
dialogue. Integration. And
absolutely.
And it's, you see stories, you're starting to see, it's starting, you're seeing these stories of, organic strawberry farmer, he's getting sick. I just seen this one the other day. He was getting sick working in strawberry fields for these other guys. Actually, he was the first guy to farm organic strawberries in the U.S.
Wow.
And they did a little feature on him. And he was getting sick working from this other guy's farm. And he started large-scale organic strawberry farming. And then other farmers started copying him. Because it was working, right? And a lot of times these guys are getting better results as well. So I we definitely got a long road, but I think we're on our way, and I think it's crucial not to alienate and create this divisive conversation between the already existing farmers, cow farmers, pig farmers, beef farmers, and those of us who just want farming in general and the food system just to be better for everybody.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. And I would fear that readers would look at my book and be like, this is gender, this is divisive, this is just going to divide us. Yeah. And that's not why I wrote the book. I wrote the book in a more, at least with a celebratory intention.
To me, I've been drawing a person's ability to be more environmentally sustainable to wealth. Right, so it has a double negative, right? You know, when you become like the super rich, typically they're far more wasteful. But there's a minimum line of security for any human where they have to be past that in order to even give a shit about, you know, the environment or not wasting or you know, making proper food choices. Because if they're worried about, you know,
Surviving.
how am I eating? They're not going to be worried about throwing plastic straws in the ditches, you know, as an example. So I think there's I don't think there's any way to disconnect, you know, minimum getting society above that minimum poverty line and strengthening equal opportunity, right? Men, woman, you know, black, white, you know, like the whole society, and you just making sure those opportunities are there. And those opportunities, a lot of times, will get there by default by leveling that basic need playing field. You know, like in Canada, you know, what would be better if I was to try to pick something better than the carbon tax? What would I pick? I would probably pick, you know, universal health care, or sorry, universal child care, right?
Okay.
You know, so you know, you put those, you know, where can we go from here? Well, if universal child care was in place, well, who does that affect the most? Well, that affects the lowest income people the most, because now they can afford it, right? Because they can put their, you know, it doesn't middle class or wealthy middle class and up. Well, it benefits them, still benefits them less, you know, on a percentage of income basis, but it certainly gives those people that were below the poverty line all of a sudden that equal opportunity to now go earn more, because they can afford to put their children in. They can take a entry-level minimum wage job to get going, right? You know, at least, and they're not losing money. Right. And that's the situation Canadians are in, you know, nowadays, and you know, and I think that's really where our overall focus needs to be, because the shifts that we seem to be making now, it's like, well, let's tax society into behaving better, right? Well, aren't you just taxing, you know, this impoverished family's ability, because they're not going to be able to go buy that electric car, as an example, right? Tomorrow. They just can't, right? Because they're barely putting food on the table. So then what goes out the window? You know, little Susie's soccer camp, right? Or whatever it happens to be. Those are the first things that start getting stripped out of the family unit as costs go up for everybody. And it's just, I mean, you know, if there's two methods of control of help, you know, of equal of environmental control, and one of them is driving cost up for everybody, and the other one is driving cost down for everybody. You know, I just think that's the, you know, I just don't think we're having the right conversation. But all right, so that was my warm up.
Okay, nice, good.
So I'm going to read you. So I talked about, you know, the imagery in a lot of your writing, and I find throughout the book, I really appreciate, you know, the analogies and metaphors and all the things that and just the, you know, the imagery you're able to provide through your words. So this is not an incredibly intense one, but it really hit me. The rivers thickened with waste, plastic and human. Yeah, and that, you know, so this is, you're talking about a river in India here, and, you know, that image just populated in my mind immediately. It's such a horrendous image. I just pictured this really thick river. that was horrible, which is what you say here. You say thick, and but you know, the really emotional parts of the book, the parts, and this is a theme throughout. I mean, you can't talk about women and their lives without kids and children being an integral, intrinsic part of all your stories. and some of the situations were worse than others. But I have a couple. I marked a couple quotes here through the book that I'd like to get you to read, and then so that one down at the bottom.
Yeah. People buried girls like seeds, hiding them beneath the surface of the land on which their mothers labored. In the rice paddies, the women worked with bent backs, and in the reflection of the water, they saw the faces of their daughters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, and that's speaking in context of like a historical practice and cultural practice that happened, unfortunately, in India, and it's happened elsewhere in places like China, and that's the issue of female infanticide. So when women give birth to girls, and this is, I should note that this is more of a historical practice, and it has changed tremendously in like the last decade or so, but it's hard. It was for me, because I visited this part of India where that practice was very prevalent. It was a hard story to ignore, especially when writing a book focused on gender and gender equality. And so a professor at the University of Madurai told me about this practice, this historical practice, and he said one of the ways that families would like essentially, well, it's infanticide, if essentially kill their daughters, was to place a single grain of rice in the throat so she would choke, and then they'd be buried. And why? It's not because, I'm not saying it's because people don't like girls or women, but it's because of this terrible economic situation that's been set up where, and cultural too, where the culture of dowry, the practice of dowry, having to save money to marry your daughter into a good family, is so difficult for low income, very poor families, that raising a daughter is like it's like this burden, this economic burden on your hands. And so unfortunately, with all sorts of factors that are influencing the way that people are able or not able to live happy, healthy lives, the practice of female infanticide became really prevalent in India because it's just so difficult to save for dowry, to marry their daughters.
Yeah, it was a economic situation.
Yeah.
These parents, it was a historical survival maneuver that and often they would just do that to survive.
Yeah, and it's like we're not talking even just like a few cases. Like it was like it's in the millions, And like I just read an article in the Washington Post the other day that was focusing on what is the impact today, or what is the result now because of that practice in places like India and also in China as well, where there was the one child policy for a long time. And what is the result today? Well, you have this massive gender imbalance where there are now more men in the communities than women. And the article was looking at what are going to be the social impacts of having a lot of men that are not going to be able to find partners. They may not be able to marry. Yeah. And what kind of impact is that going to have on society? So it may not be practiced today as prevalently as before, but it's still created this, hugely, this hugely real thing in their communities today.
So I got another one here for you. So that was related to children in India, and this one here is the new Congo. If you read this one over here.
Yeah. Okay. Horrified, she watched as he carried the stick, a red, burning ember at its tip, and without hesitation plunged it into the roof made with the husks from last year's harvest. The roof caught fire and crackled. Her son screamed. Her mother wailed a prayer. She watched helplessly as the fire consumed the house, and her children were reduced to a thick white ash that floated in the sky.
So that was Miranda, I believe.
That was...
Wait a second here. Gloria.
Gloria.
Sorry, that was Gloria.
Yeah.
So that was the story of a woman named Gloria. And that one really got to me. And what was especially painful about that statement, or about that that part of the story, her story, is that in a blink of an eye, and at that moment that these rebels, that was the war between the that was the Congolese
Yeah,
war, right?
that
The
was in.
Tutsis and the
So her glorious story is she's originally from Eastern Congo,
yeah
and when I met her, she was living with her family, her surviving family, and farming in the Nachi Valley refugee settlement, which is a refugee settlement in southwestern Uganda. And I went there specifically to talk to women who've been displaced from the war and conflict and just massive human rights atrocities that have happened in Eastern Congo for the last 3 decades and are ongoing today, about what it's been like to move from farming in Eastern Congo to and surviving these terrible, terrible things like the passage that I just read, and surviving still in this refugee settlement today, and still digging, still coaxing seeds from the soil, because it's a very tough place to farm and very different conditions from where they were farming in Eastern Congo, where they were in a mountainous region with volcanic soils and arguably a much better farming context than in the flat, hot, sort of plains of the Nachi Valley refugee settlement. So just the women I met there had survived unthinkable things, witnessing, their daughters being raped, their husbands being killed, their parents and their children being burned alive. And that was, people asked me what was the hardest part about the research for this book, and certainly it was hearing those stories. That you just have a physical reaction to, because it's uncomprehendable. It really is. It's how do those women wake up in the morning and continue to plant and dig? And I saw the way that they were working together in groups, and and gathering strength from church and the social services available to them, and rebuilding their lives in this place that is not their home, and knowing that they will never go back to those ancestral gardens. I just was in awe. Like, what strength of a woman or human must you be to endure that? Like, the strength of the human spirit is so amazing, and those women to me embody resilience. And I have no words. It was
and the story and what happened to Gloria there's other similar horrific stories through the book of what other women have gone through, but it really impacted me that she had lit this fire in the morning, and she's preparing food for her family that she had in theory had farmed herself, I would assume, and in the course of a day or however long that horrible transaction happened, when the rebels came in and took her home, and then put her 7 and 9-year-old son and her in-laws in this hut, and watched these rebels take the fire that she had lit, and that was I'm sure it's, being an outsider reading this horrific story, you're just trying to you're just getting the emotion that you're getting from reading it, and you're trying to grasp on, and maybe I'm grasping onto something that of course she would never maybe process, or I don't know. Like, I'd be on the same page as you. I have a really hard time, when I put myself in Gloria's shoes, how would I get out of bed the next day? And you're putting, as a parent especially, you're putting your children you're putting yourself in Gloria's shoes, and trying to imagine, and that's really when it gets you. And then they use the fire that she lit, and then she loses most of her family, and then has to escape and survive. And similar to the imagery of the women in India that are bent down in the rice paddies, seeing the faces of their daughters in the fields. And that's what they all keep coming back to. The farming, the digging and the farming and the food production is just this consistent part of life, that no matter what happened, they're just back to that. You know, they're back planting. You know, and that's what's so interesting about the whole thing. It's their, to me, it was their refuge. You know, every time they were in the soil, and you touch on that a little bit for some of the women. Almost what seemed to be propping them up to get through that was the actual farming.
Yeah, it's people ask me what's the similarity that connects all of these women in these different places, and I often say being mothers, raising children, growing food, because above the bottom line is children, is they're putting all of their resources into their children to make sure that they're healthy, to make sure they have a sense of identity on the land, to make sure that they might have an opportunity to go to school, and maybe not even be farmers, to be able to make the choice if they want to farm or if they don't want to farm. And I'll give you a couple examples. In Uganda, the first women's group that I met with, when I was interviewing the women's group, they started telling me their birth stories. And like a lot of these women would have, in a rural community, would have anywhere from 3 to maybe 7 children, depending on the age of the woman. Certainly as women today are having fewer children than they did before. But that's a common thread around the world too, is rural families tended to have more children. But many of these women would dig up until their last month of pregnancy. One woman even told me she delivered her son in her pea field. You know, she just felt the labor pangs coming on. She called her, her sister who was digging next to her, her friend, and who came running with a plastic washing basin and maybe a tiny little razor purchased from one of the corner stores. And they give birth squatting over.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's another, whenever you hear that, and then I had my baby, in the field.
Yeah.
That's another unimaginable thing for me as a man. I can't, when my wife, when there was a baby growing inside her stomach, and 2 have grown there now. I just found myself in awe, but also a little bit disturbed, and I felt a little bit of anxiety for her, because I would hold my stomach and go, okay, just pretend there's something in there, moving, that you're raising, that a human is growing inside you. I can't even get past that part, let alone, there's some women that are just able out there in this world just to successfully have a baby, while they're at work in the field.
You can't even imagine. And the women laughed because they would see my expression, and I was just like horrified, and they just laughed. They thought it was so funny that I would think that's so unusual for someone to give birth in a pea field or a sorghum field, right?
Yeah.
Because that's
normal for them.
That's normal. And of course, access to healthcare is increasing in those places. And I don't want to romanticize that story at all, because the risk of, if you have a complication during childbirth, or the risk of hemorrhaging and being unable to get from a rural community to a health center where they can help you is, that's a serious concern. Access to adequate maternal child health care.
It's not a great thing. They're doing it from necessity.
No.
And they've become, some of them probably fairly good at it because of necessity.
On the other hand, it shows their strength. It shows their resilience. And also the way that the women rally around one another, because I found those birth stories really interesting, how the other female farmers would come, and then even after the woman's given birth, they would then go to that woman's plot and do her work for her. So it was sort of this, maybe they don't have access to mat leave, but the women create their own systems of support on a very grassroots level. And that always inspired me, the way that they were organizing no matter what. Maybe a government wasn't providing that service for them, but they would provide it to one another. And I found that so beautiful and supportive.
Now, did they have a preference, to Jas's question? Was it better in a sorghum field or the pea field? Did they have a baby having
well, you
preference?
Know, you laugh, but I actually asked them. I did. And I started to feel like maybe women are actually planning their births around what they're doing in the field. Because if you know that you can only take like a week off after you've had your baby, or you're going to be digging, or doing a hard part of, like, a lot of women told me, what's the worst part, or what's the hardest part on your body for agriculture? Weeding, because you're bent.
Yeah.
So weeding can be so excruciating. But the women actually said to me one of the worst times to have a young child, so if you've already had your baby, and I mean, I saw the daycare in the fields, like the women put down their kitenjes, those cloth materials, or the skirts, and they make a little like shade over top of their baby and on the ground, so they're kind of sheltered. But they said the worst time to have a young child is in the sorghum harvest.
Really?
And the sorghum grows very tall. Like it grows like at least probably like 2 meters.
Okay, what is sorghum?
Sorghum, okay, yeah. Yeah, it's an indigenous crop to that part of Uganda, and it's a grain crop.
Okay.
So I mean, for people that can't eat like gluten, for example, it's kind of one of those up and rising, at least in North America.
Yeah.
Non-gluten grains. So you can bake with it. You can do similar things with wheat. But in Uganda, what did they do with it? They make it into a porridge, which they called obushera.
Okay.
And in rural Uganda, this part of Uganda, you can't visit someone's home without serving them obushera. There's this saying that I think it's one of the opening lines in that chapter, is if you sit down in someone's house and you don't serve them obushera, well, the rats should come and devour everything in your house because you've just committed, a major offense, cultural offense. And so it's one of the most important crops, but has a long growing season, 8 months that they're growing this crop. So it's a big deal. And it's also a cash crop for some women too, which is interesting because there's so few cash crops available for women in that part of Uganda.
And it's a cash crop because of the Western demand?
Because this is interesting, and I'm just thinking this out loud. I think part of the reason it's still viable for small farmers in the market is because who else is growing sorghum worldwide? I actually don't even know, but we don't often hear about the trade of sorghum, really. So I mean, there's no subsidized sorghum being grown in the U.S. being imported into these countries or into Uganda. So there's still a local market for it, and people. And I mean, I just said it's like a cultural drink. You have to serve people obushera. So I think that's why maybe it's still like economically viable. Is people will consume it, but they'll also maybe save a couple of bags to sell because there's no competition. It's their own local market, and it's hugely important. But for child rearing, you don't want to have a young baby when you're harvesting sorghum because it's also a really pointy, tall stalk. So the women said it's actually a risk because if we're working with our babies tied on our backs, the baby could be poked by a stalk. It could be dangerous. And then another thing is that snakes. Snakes love bushy areas, and the sorghum creates that kind of little micro environment. Yeah. So the risk of putting your baby down on the ground and a snake coming is a huge risk. So it's a good question, actually. Apparently there are seasons where it's better to have a baby and not when you're a farmer in Uganda.
So in Canada, the hipsters are looking for sorghum or the gluten intolerant people, or we're searching for it, and there were, they're trying not to have their babies
during
in the
that
sorghum
time.
fields.
Yeah.
That's
that interesting.
That's a crazy dynamic. Yeah.
But what's interesting too is there's another urban farmer that I interviewed in Victoria, and shortly after she wasn't from a farming background. She moved out to BC because a lot of people know if you want to be a woman farmer in Canada, you go to BC because it's considered this like mecca of women working on sustainable, small scale organic farms. Yeah, it's the place to be apparently. Yeah. But I think the same is said to be true for in Atlantic Canada. The numbers of female farmers are on the rise. Yeah. And Quebec as well. Those are like the hot spots. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Good. I am aware of a couple prominent female farmers in my region where I grew up in Miramichi, New Brunswick, actually, now that you mentioned that.
I bet.
And they're they're kind of leader, they're becoming community leaders and people that men and women are looking to these strong figures. And I've noticed that in New Brunswick a bit too.
I would have loved to get out to the East Coast to do research there as well. But the woman I did interview in BC, she told me, and she was an urban farmer, she said she'd do the same thing. She'd tie her baby on her back and she'd be bent over her raised beds, weeding or harvesting or whatever. And people would walk by. And she said one time this lady said, "Oh, you're just like a woman in Africa." And she said, and urban farmers have told me this before too, it's an interesting dynamic doing your job where it's so visible. People can see you and make comments and stuff. And she said she looked up at the lady kind of horrified and she was like, "I'm nothing like that's nothing like that." But I said to her, well, it's because you're comparing scale. And of course, yes, you do have access to more services than a lot of the women I interviewed in Uganda, but it's still the same issue of what do you do with your children if you don't have access to mat leave?
Hey, bring them with you.
Or you can't afford childcare. You bring them with you. Bring them into the gardens or whatever it is farm task that you're doing, and that does have an impact on your productivity and stuff.
And typically the men aren't stripping the kids to their back and taking them to the market, right, to sell the food.
Maybe that's changing, though.
That changing?
I'd like to believe there's some male farmers out there with like babies on their backs or in the front carriers.
I've brought my children to some business meetings.
There you go.
I have that flexibility. My wife actually can't bring our kids to her work, so
there you go.
I have that choice sometimes.
Yeah,
but
I think it's changing.
The business meetings slow down a little bit, though. I'll be honest with you.
For sure. Yeah.
When your 4-year-old's going, "Daddy, Daddy." Well, I mean, you'll have some time. You can make it to the East Coast in your second book, Women Still Digging.
Yeah.
Right?
Digging hasn't stopped.
You could feature Atlantic Canada first, and then kind of move out from there.
I would love that. Yeah, I would love that.
The other fun thing that I found going through the book was your. And I'll use the Anthony Bourdain parts unknown experience that you did have with each of these interviews. You were always eating something, and you went into that a lot of times, and it really helped bring me into your experience as well. You spent a lot of time on those experiential details. It's not like you're just hammering through here and you've got some stats in here, but very few. This isn't a this story's about people, and your experience with them. It's not an environmental statistic book. It's about real women doing real things and real farmers and your interaction with them. So just kind of tell me about that. Like, what did that mean to your experiences? Did you have some do you have some new dietary strategies now that you've come back from all these countries, or favorite foods?
Definitely. Yeah. Oh, I love that you asked that question. I enjoyed writing this book so much. I enjoyed writing the writing part less than the experiencing. Yeah. I loved the travel bit and the interviews with women. I remember all the details when I travel. I mean, of course you're leaving out some, but I wanted to capture that I wanted to bring readers into the homes of the women who hosted me, and they were amazing hosts, like everywhere I went. Before we started the interview, there'd be some sort of drink or food, whether in Nicaragua, it was usually like this, I call it campo coffee. Campo means countryside in Spanish, and it's like this very black, sugary, boiled coffee. I think some people call it cowboy coffee. Yeah. So it's not very refined, but it
sounds delicious.
It's still delicious. It's delicious.
You're just basically saying to me, sugary caffeine is what I'm hearing.
and it's hot, so it's kind of an odd thing to drink. But I love drinking the campo coffee and little sugary fried goods or salty goods. And I mean, I interviewed some cacao farmers, so like cocoa farmers in Nicaragua. And so there was hot chocolate that a lady made for me, from the actual cocoa beans that she had produced. And it's really cool because they're growing cocoa as an alternative to growing the African palm oil, which is really hard on the environment, involves a lot of like heavy use of pesticides and whatnot. So that was really special.
That was one of my most jealous points, actually, in the book, where I was picturing you just drinking this like really fresh, off the cacao plant, hot chocolate.
That was certainly one of the more tasty ones. And then in India, like, don't even get me started about India. Everything I ate and drank in India was so delicious. Usually it was a cup of steaming chai that every farmer would provide me or offer to me. So in Rajasthan, in northern India, one woman was raising water buffalo, and she milked the buffalo for milk, and it played a big role in the way that she cooked and women in that area cook. And she served me ghee, which is a form of clarified butter. It's very rich, so delicious. And she made yogurts out of the milk, which is great in India when when you're eating spicy foods. It's nice to cool off the palate. In southern India, I had dosa, tons of curries and different types of chutneys, and just really the food culture in India was so impressive. The taste and women's connection to serving
Did
food.
India kind of get the gold medal out of the countries? Was that the...
Yes.
Yeah, on the food side.
When I think of India, I think of eating. So
Yeah.
yes, yeah. But everywhere the food culture was so interesting, and women's hospitality just blew me away. It was what they had to offer. In Uganda, one of my favorite stories was, riding to these rural communities on a motorcycle, and then we left this one community, my translator, the driver, and I, so 3 people on one motorcycle. And a farmer named Peace, she offered us this huge rice sack filled with pineapples that she had just harvested. And I was like, this is too much. We don't even have room to bring this.
Like a large sack?
A huge sack. And I was like, we don't even have room for this. And Lillian, my translator, was like, we have to accept it. It would be so rude not to.
Yeah.
And so we strapped it onto the back of the motorcycle and, returned home. And inevitably the motorcycle broke down that day. So we had to push it up. Yeah. We had to push it up this hill and then coast all the way down.
So you got 3 people and then 100 pounds of
pineapples. Yeah. But it made that woman so proud to share her food with us.
Absolutely.
So yes, the food culture and the offering of food was it was so beautiful everywhere I went. So I had to connect readers to that because it was such an important part of the process.
But not everything was delicious. Well, give me maybe even just one of like something you'll never forget that you had to choke down.
It's a tough love with the obushera, which I mentioned earlier.
Obushera, yeah.
And that's the sorghum drink that's
it is sorghum.
so important to Ugandan culture
Yeah.
and was offered to us everywhere. And it's the best way to describe it is it tastes very fermented, sour. And then it was the texture that really threw me because it wasn't very refined. It was very gritty. So that was a tough love. It took a while to enjoy that. But I would find if we were climbing, if a woman's house was up on the hill, and we had to climb to get there. It's sort of like the first time you realize you like beer. You don't like it at first.
Yeah.
But then on a hot, sweltering day, sometimes like water just doesn't satisfy your thirst the same way beer does, or as I learned, obushera. So, so I did love
Under
it.
the right conditions, obushera.
It was a tough love.
Was all right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah. So what is? So you're back now.
I'm back.
You've written the book. It's out. How long has it been out now?
It's been out since the beginning of March.
Beginning of March. So we're not too far in. And congratulations!
Thank
you just got #1 top nonfiction seller in Calgary.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
One ahead of Mr. Marcello.
Oh, you should take that off the record.
Okay, I won't put that in. Okay, come on. I was just trying to poke a little bit. All right, we're going to edit all this part out.
He'd kill me. Though he was joking with me about it. But yeah, I don't want to anyways, I can't offend my mentor.
No, that would be bad. No. Yeah, so what is... I'll just cut it where I went like that.
Yeah.
So what is what are the next steps? So it's only been out for over a month now. How is it going so far? #1 in Calgary, nonfiction already. That's something for sure. That's a big deal.
I'm totally blown away by the reception I've been getting from people. Yeah. I've had 3 launches so far, one in Edmonton, one in Peace River, which is where I grew up. That's a town in northern Alberta. And then another one in Calgary. And they've been bursting at the seams. There's been so many people at each event. I've been so blown away by the reception that I've received so far for this book, specifically. No, I'm not even talking from critics, but from people themselves who've told me what it means to them and how they're enjoying the writing or they're being taken into the places where I've described, or that their eyes have been opened to some of the issues that I write about. That has been so meaningful to me, and I've been so just humbled by, because you get asked why did you decide to write this book? And I think a lot of writers or artists or people who are putting a lot of creativity in their work, you're not always really sure what you're doing when you set out. And then, and I include myself in this book, so it really is kind of like this story and journey for myself. And now I'm at this point in the process of, talking about this book that took me 5 years to write about. And part of me worried, like, maybe I'm not even interested in this anymore. You know, like the classic, like, PhD student or master's student that totally loses interest in what they've just spent all this time studying. But I don't feel that way at all. I feel very passionate about the subject. And I can also see how relevant a lot of the issues I write about still are. You wonder, okay, maybe if it's published 5 years after you're writing about this, are these issues still important? Oh, yes. I mean, in fact, the book was born into this, you know, into the Me Too movement, into the Time Is Up, into this very vocal time for women, especially in North America, and I should say worldwide too. And we have social media to thank for that. So it's coming out at a time where there's so many conversations already taking place, and I feel humbled that my book gets to be a tiny voice within that much larger conversation that's happening. But something for me that is really important is now wondering and sort of dreaming of, like, next steps. How do I take this book and make it meaningful for the women who shared their stories with me?
Yeah.
So the next steps for me are not only continuing to share it in Canada and North America, but I would like to be able to return to places like Guatemala or Uganda, find a translator to help me translate the stories into their local languages and make it meaningful for the women who opened up to me.
Oh, to get the book back in the hands of the stories in here.
Yeah, because and a lot of people have been asking me, like, how did the women who you interviewed benefit? And I think, I mean, we can talk as much as we want about, like, you know, raising awareness about issues and ways that in North America, like, people can support international development projects. And yes, that's all important, but what's the identity of these women today? And would a book like this that celebrates their stories and elevates their stories, would that be meaningful in their communities as well? So I'm looking for sensitive ways to be able to, I guess, return what I learned and what I saw to the places where people opened up to me and invited me into their home and served me obushera. So yeah, it's the hope to be able to return the favor, really.
Yeah, I mean, I would only assume that if you're able to get this book, but I mean, you interviewed 143 women? Was that was the number?
Yeah.
And how many stories made it? I didn't count as I went through. How many stories made it into the book?
I don't know the exact number, but each chapter has at least, I would say, anywhere from 5 to 8 stories that I chose to highlight. Yeah.
So about 40.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you had there's a good amount of stories covered in here, but you had to leave 100 behind. Mm-hmm. You know, and that really highlights the amount of, I mean, that was your whole life for you know, the last, and it's, well, let's call it the last 5 years, and well, now the book's out. So now you know, like you said, you're in that next phase of life with this project, and you know, it could go on for another few years, depending on where you do go from here. Because I do, you know, the story is timely. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was brought into many specific issues that weren't necessarily on my radar. It's put countries that were not necessarily on my radar. But you do leave the book feeling that question. Well, what do I do? You know, what do I do next? Or what is the call to arms, so to speak?
Exactly.
So what do you see for yourself, or what would be your goals over the next few years? You know, the book has barely just got launched, but you know, and that can be Canada, U.S. You know, do you want a million? You want to sell 1 million copies? Do you want it to go global? Do you want it to spur something? You know, have you rolled around a few scenarios for yourself?
I think it's, especially being like an emerging writer, and feeling like a very small fish in a very large ocean. I feel like it's hard to even comprehend the book having that much of an impact. Could it? I don't know. I didn't set out to write this book because I wanted, I don't know. I can't imagine what that would be like for it to be so successful. I've been so humbled just by like the small success that it's already have. But I think the most I can hope for, and I'm realizing what feels the most amazing to me, is knowing that this book is sparking conversations. Even, and just a tiny example, even I was back in Peace River for Easter, and I had dinner with some of my family friends, and it was the men in the room who were discussing my book, who read my book, and they had all these things to say about it. in a way that was very complimentary towards gender equality and how their eyes had been opened, or they had learned something about the book, or about what about this. And I want this book to make people talk and make people think and reflect. And in a perfect world, it would hopefully, if people can afford to do so, change the way that people eat, or change the way that people vote. People often say, well, what could we do here in Canada? And I say, okay, first go to the farmers markets. If that is accessible to you, if you can afford to put your income towards that and buying those types of foods, go meet those local farmers and try and support them with your dollars. But meet them and hear their stories, and then learn about their issues, because we can all vote for certain agricultural policies, and we don't often think about ourselves as maybe agricultural policy doesn't matter to us because we're not farmers, but we're consumers, so it matters hugely to us. So to become more informed, to get to know people locally in our communities and try and support these local viable economies, I think is really hugely important. And if it's an option for you to support international development organizations, like Oxfam Canada is an amazing one. That's the pillars of their organization really are food security and gender empowerment, and not just gender empowerment in kind of these surface terms, but actually seeing women be able to access farmland or rise in political leadership in their communities. So there are good organizations doing great work that people, I think, could support if that's an option for them financially. But mostly just talk. Like I love having this conversation with you now. What ideas will this conversation inspire amongst other people? Like that's how we're really gonna, I think, see social environmental change in our communities is by ideas. The Cubans are famous for saying in their Cuban propaganda, and it's interesting, you drive through the farmland there, and you may not see advertisements, but you see these giant billboards with the government propaganda messages. But there's this one that I read, and it was like, the ideas, or of all the resources we have, ideas are the most important. And I think that's so true.
Yeah, that's good propaganda.
It's good propaganda, yeah. They also have things too, like that, like gender equality is the future and things like that, or is, hugely, like the women fighting with us are hugely important for our cause and things like that. So that's like bad translations. But I want these stories to be meaningful. I want them to be meaningful for the people who shared them with me, for the people who can relate to them, and then for the people who can't relate to them. I hope that they'll be able to take away something from it, to be able to better understand someone who's different from them. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Well, I think it's an incredibly important story. I think, any man that reads it, he'll be better off at the end of the book. Any woman that reads it, any person that reads it, just in general, it's the story of the world as it is today for people in other walks of life that are resilient against these circumstances that most of us, here in Canada, could never imagine. And but I think people can find takeaways from this book that can make Canada a better place, and by learning from these stories. So I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I add one more thing quickly?
No.
Please. I just thought of something good I should say.
Yes, you can add.
Because so people often ask me, how can we help? What can we do?
Yeah.
And I say, women are already doing the work. And I really hope that's what people will take away from the book, is seeing how all these small-scale grassroots ways that no matter how tough the barriers, women are still finding ways to be resilient and to fight against those systems that are oppressing them. So hear their stories, read their stories, and recognize the change is already happening on the ground. Slowly, but yes, it's happening. Lillian, my friend from Uganda, who helped me so much with the research, I wanted to end the book with one of her quotes, which talks about the river. And she says to me, because I think after some of our interviews that we did together, I felt really sad or really disheartened about the situation. And she said to me, she says, the hope is not so obvious, but you see that women are doing the work. And she said, women are like a great river. You can't, sometimes the river doesn't look like it's moving very fast at the surface, but underneath the force is so strong that it's going to erode anything in its path. So she said, women are like the river. And I guess that's what I hope people take away from the book, is seeing that women are doing the work, the change is happening, and so to find ways to be allies to that change and to support that change in different communities.
Yeah. No, I think that's like that's a great way to end our talk.
Yeah.
And
That's why I was like, oh, I should sneak
yeah.
that in.
Yeah, no, it is. I did take that away.
Okay,
that women are
cool.
doing the work, and it is. There is some comfort in the resilience of these women, even in the most destitute circumstances.
Exactly.
That are featured here. But
yeah.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
No problem. Thank you.